Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Claire Robinson. I'm the Customer Relationship Manager here at KRC. Thank you all for joining us for our monthly Agile webinar, which today is about project and product environments. What's the difference and why does it matter? Next month, we're doing something a little different. We've teamed up with the APMG, the accreditation body here in the UK that looks after qualifications such as Prince 2 and Agile PM. And Keith will be presenting a webinar for them on the subject of combining Agile PM with Scrum. That'll take place on Tuesday the 30th of July at 2 p.m. That's British Standard Time. I'll be sending out invites nearer the time, plus you can also register on our website. If you want to download the slides from today's webinar, they're available on our website now. Go to AgileKRC.com, click on resources and then on free downloads. While you're in the resources section of the website, you might want to check out our webinar archive where you can download all of our previous recordings. I'm shortly going to pass you over to your presenter, Keith Richards, but just a couple of things before I do. If you want to tweet about today's webinar, you can use the hashtag AgileKRC webinar. You can also follow us at AgileKRC. If you want to hear more about today's subject from Keith, you can check out his blog at AgileKRC.com. I'd also just like to point out a couple of features of the control panel, just in case this is your first time using the software. So if you look at the top right-hand side of your screen, you'll see an orange box with a white arrow inside. Click on this to maximize or minimize your control panel. If you'd like to ask a question, just type your questions into the question box and Keith will take as many as he can at the end. So without any further ado, I'm going to pass you over to Keith. Keith, over to you.
Thank you very much, Claire, and welcome everybody to another webinar. We're still getting some great feedback, and just went to a conference yesterday and a few people came up and said they're regular listeners to the webinar, and it was really good to get some feedback about what people are doing when they're listening. We are aware that sometimes it's groups of 2s and 3s and even as many as 30 or 40 in a sort of theatre, so this is fine by us, and we find out that when the polls come on it makes you chat with each other, and it's quite nice to know that because we didn't realise that was actually happening. Now, in terms of this webinar, we gave you an entry question about what you were working on. Are you working on just products? Are you working on just projects? Or are you working on a bit of both? And the response is quite interesting because 39% said they're just working on projects. And I'm going to explain a little bit more about the differences as we go through. In terms of working on both, so we're spending some time on projects and also spending time on product environments and enhancements, that was actually 38%. Now the surprising figure to me was how many are working just purely in a product environment, and the answer to that was 3%, which is extremely low. And I think if I'd done this survey, say, a year ago, I think that figure would be a lot higher. Because what's happening in Agile at the moment is I think people are realizing to scale up Agile, to get something a little bit more structured, to take on the bigger problems, we're going to need to use things a little bit more structure, and this is where the project mechanism comes in. 20% of the respondents said neither, so that might be they weren't quite sure, so they sort of ticked none of the above, or they might be working at program level, so it's not really that's not really what they're working on, as in i.e. a project or a product. Right, let's get going. Without just one quick one, often people like the name checks of the people listening onto the webinar, and often we get little sort of clusters of people popping up in various countries, and we've got Hungary today, seems to be a little bit more widely represented than normal. We've also got some people from Lithuania, quite a lot of people from India, and just a plug for Houston over there in Texas, the home of the famous Houston, we got a problem. So let's have a look. Project and product environments. Let's go through what we're going to be looking at and try and give you an idea where we're going, because the subject might seem a little bit I don't know, dry or not particularly clear what I'm driving at with this situation. But as we go through the next 30 or 40 minutes, I think you're going to find some things that are very, very powerful and completely underestimated in a lot of people's agile ways of working. So if you could hang in there, I think you're going to find some really interesting nuggets as we go through this. I'm going to be outlining why I'm asking this question, why it's such a big deal. We're going to be talking about something I call work filtering. We're going to be talking about how to use Agile in complicated situations, but also this idea of whether you could just use a one-stop shop, one process that's going to cater for all of your business as usual work and also all of your project work as well. To try and, if you like, create one process. I'll explain more about that when we come to that point. So, just a quick introduction. I know a lot of people are familiar with this, but just for those new people, because we get new people coming on all the time, KRC is very much a sort of pioneering training company. We like to be a little bit different, and that's why we're into things like webinars a long time before everybody else. We specialise in Agile. In fact, we do Agile, Agile and Agile, and we've been doing it for a long time, 15 years. And I've written a book on Agile Project Management, and I was very pleased to be voted Most Valuable Agile Player at the UK Awards a year or so back. Now, I want to start with an analogy, and I don't want to be too simplistic or even naff with this analogy, because I think it's a really important one. And if you look at something like ice dancing and ice hockey, and you sort of compare and contrast the two, you'll find that there's a lot of similarities between the two. A lot of similar skills are needed. A lot of the techniques and the way you go about things, very much the basics are identical in both of these sports. But they are very different. They are not the same thing. You wouldn't really want to get them mixed up. You wouldn't really want Torval and Dean body checking each other or anything like that. It's a completely different sport and a completely different context. It's just, as I say, when you're in contact with the ice, a lot of the basics are actually the same. So you wouldn't get them mixed up. And equally, you don't want to get your project work mixed up with your product work either. And blurring between the two, or, well, it's sort of okay and does it make a big difference? Well, this is what I'm going to show you during this webinar. It makes a massive difference. It can really make you into just totally the wrong position. So, you do not want to get project work mixed up with your product work. I'm just going to take you through a slide now just to outline some of the basics about what I'm talking about here in terms of the difference, because if you can understand the difference, you can see where it fits in at your organization. Now, I know this slide I used about 9 months ago in a webinar, but I'm going to use it in a slightly different angle. And what I'm going to try to get everyone to realize is the difference between a product environment where things like Scrum are extremely popular and a project environment where things like perhaps, say, DSDM as an agile method is sort of more appropriate and more popular in that context. Just imagine you have an existing product like a TomTom sat-nav or Garmin satellite navigation system, and what you do in a product environment with something that already exists is you come up with a list of features or a backlog or a shopping list of things that you want to put into the existing product. And then bit by bit, sprint by sprint, or time box by time box, you add these things to the existing product. Now, this is reasonably straightforward. The general term, and a term we use a lot at KRC, is the term BAU, business as usual. It's routine, it's for things like enhancements, it's reasonably simple. To be honest, you can't do it with your eyes shut, but it's straightforward. And the key thing here about this is we do not need a project manager. We can give it to the technical people. We can say, look, you're empowered, get on with it. It might take 5 days, 15 days, whatever, but we don't need to manage these people in terms of if they were part of a team. Now, we still need to sanction the work. It still needs to be authorized, but that is different to what I would call a project environment. If you think about building, say, the TomTom sat-nav product from scratch, you would actually start with nothing. And what you would do in a project is you would start to look at some upfront decisions and some upfront work, for example, like an outline business case. You then might do some extra work in DSDM or Agile PM. This is called foundations. In Prince, it would be called something, initiating a project. But all this upfront work is to try and work out, hey, should we really be doing this? What do we need to know about this? What's the architectural constraints, business constraints, anything to do with quality, risk, compliance? how do we operate this thing, how do we cut it over to live. A really good example of what we need to do up front would be something like release management. Now all of this is very much it's just meat and drink to a project. It's exactly what projects are set up to do. And this is why if you could put these sort of upfront or front end, as it's often called, in front of your Scrum, for example, or your time boxing, you've got a much better chance of success. Because projects are by their very nature complicated. It's almost a definition of a project that it's complicated. If it was routine or simple, we don't want to be doing it as a project. We would do it business as usual. So projects are complicated, they're often unique, and they need to be managed. We need a layer of project management over the top. So if you've got 10, 15, 25 people working on something, you're not going to be able to do it in a sort of a backlog BAU sort of style. But on top of that, we need to have good governance, and this is where good old-fashioned things like a project board or a steering group come in. And on top of that, it needs to fit into a wider picture. What's the strategic vision? If you like, at a program level. Now I'm going to come back to that program level point later on, because this decision between project and product environment is very much often in the hands of the people running programs, and if they don't understand the agile implications of what's going on here, you can often get a very big disconnect. So, first thing we need to do in order to solve this is we need to come up with something called a work filter. At KRC we call it a work filter or a hopper or a funnel, and it's really about looking at the work you've got to do and trying to understand, well, what is it? Is this simple or is this complex? And that's not as easy as it sounds, and often the problem is what happens when it's slightly marginal or between, if you like, around the borderline. And what we try to get people to do is look for what we call tendencies. We don't try to be very absolute with this, but we build a list of tendencies and things that you might want to think about in order to decide, is this a piece of project work or could we do this as BAU? And the sort of tendencies I'm talking about and looking for are things like complexity. Is it complicated? Is it big? Is this a new customer or a new part of the business that we don't know? Is this involving difficult technology? And I don't necessarily mean new technology, I actually just mean difficult technology. It could be old existing legacy stuff, it could be brand new technology that we haven't really understood fully, or it might be we're using new tooling or something on a particular project. But the key word here is this level of unknown. Now the picture there shows an American, somebody called Donald Rumsfeld, and I can't remember his exact quote, but it was something on the lines of, there's things we know, there's things we know we don't know, and there's things that we don't know we don't know. And he was referring to, if you like, what's known as the level of unknown, so unknown unknowns. And this is a great expression for when you're trying to work out what this piece of work is. How much is the unknown unknown in terms of what we're faced with? Because it could be that there's a tremendous level of risk in there, tremendous levels of unknown. It might be, however, not too bad. Yes, there's bits we don't know, but it's not really that big a deal. So this might lend it to, maybe a simple project, or even maybe we could run it as BAU. Now what I want to do now is run a quick poll to listen to everybody and get your views from the people listening to the webinar at the moment as to where you are with this idea of some sort of work filter. In terms of when a piece of work comes in, somebody comes into the office or a director comes out of an office and says, we need to do this, what sort of systems or processes or ideas do you actually use? So I'm just going to launch a poll now, so if you'd like to select your answer to this, and really I'm trying to get you to answer which of these statements is the most accurate in your opinion. So do you have any kind of work filter? Do you use a simple one? If it's less than 10K we do this, or have you got something quite sophisticated? The fourth option there is for those that either don't know if anything's going on or actually, no, we don't have anything at all. Now votes all coming in, that's looking good to me. I'll give you another 10-15 seconds. You have got very fast at this, I have to say, as we go over these webinars. already got about 85% voted. Right, I think we'll have a look there, and if I close the poll and now share it, you can have a look and see what we got there. So firstly, a third don't really have any kind of work filter. Now to those people, I think you need to try and do something reasonably soon. Admittedly, you could keep it simple to start with, but you do need to start, if you like, sifting and triaging this kind of work. The most popular answer there is 40% saying we've got a relatively simple one, which the normal suspects are a budgetary level or a time level. And if you could get to that level, you know, that's pretty good. But interestingly enough, only 1 in 5 have got something which I would call relatively, and a key word being relative there, but relatively sophisticated. But to everyone listening to the webinar, really that's where you need to get to. You need to get to some idea where we're actually quite sophisticated about how we analyse this work. Now, where we go with this might surprise you in a moment, so if you could hang in there, I'll show you how sophisticated you need to be or not, and we'll have a look at something specific about this sort of work filter. So thank you very much for your votes on that. And if we now go back to some things you need to think about for this filter, and one of the most important things is to really build this filter carefully. Now, as we said, 20% of people there, 20% of the people listening to the webinar have got some sort of sophistication, but this is where we've got to go carefully. KRC, and we've had a lot of experience of going in and working on these, and what we sometimes find is some very complicated formulas, and if this and that's greater than that and it's in this environment. We find a lot of algorithms and formulas that actually sometimes get in the way, and therefore what I'd like to think about a little bit more is whether we can loosen up that just a bit. But when I say loosen up these formulas and truth tables and scoring systems, I don't want you to throw it all away and suddenly end up with guesswork. You know, just having a guess, oh, it looks like a project, but equally a formula there's something in between. And I want to introduce you to a rather strange concept, and hopefully I think we've got something like a third of people listening to the webinar are from abroad, so I hope this translates well. But I was on the LinkedIn group only about a week ago, and we were talking about this very subject, and somebody came up with this concept called spidey sense. Now, spidey sense comes from Spider-Man, the Marvel comic character, and Spider-Man has this spidey sense where he can detect danger or problems, and what actually happens is the base of his skull at the back starts to tingle. Now, I'm not trying to literally say you need to be a little bit like Spider-Man and wait to see if anything's tingling. I don't think that's a really good way of going about this sort of work filter. But what I'm trying to get you to have a feel for is that instinct and experience is a very good test if you could back it up with what I call these ideas of tendencies. So if you're in a situation where you might look at certain projects and score them and it comes out 74 out of 100 and therefore it's a project, I would strongly advise you move away from that, because 74 on its own doesn't mean anything. What's the 26 that's missing? The 26 could be made up of the fact that the customer doesn't like us and they're not going to engage with us. I mean, that would be a massive problem. So this idea of looking at tendencies and just making almost an instinctive call is what I'm trying to get you to have a feel for. Now, we still need some process and still need some mechanics, but more look at it as a guide rather than a formula. So it could be, and we do this in several companies, we create what are called sliders, and we look at how the sliders look and make a decision on it, but we don't score them out of 10, we don't come up with a percentage, and we find this is quite powerful. But again, using your spidey sense, using your instincts, you know, look at a piece of work and go, does this need a project manager? And interestingly, you might find you'll right more often than not. But again, if you could just sit there looking at these tendencies that we talked about earlier, you're going to find yourself in a much better place. So rather than go formulaic, trust a little bit of your spidey sense. And the guy who mentioned it, I don't know the guy, but a guy called Jeff Cooper was on the LinkedIn group, and he said he used spidey sense when he's trying to do some idea of whether it's BAU or not. And I really quite like the idea. So just want to leave that thought with you, and we'll come back to that in a moment later as well. Now, in terms of what if we do find it's a project and it is agile and it's complicated, so what do we do then? If we're used to working in a product environment and we're using sprints, and a lot of the organizations that I work with, and I know that we're so far down the agile path at the moment, but so many organizations really are, behind the wave. They're dipping their toe in. They've had some success with sprints and Scrum, and they're just now looking for more. They're looking for the next step. And the next step is to try to get your Agile to scale up and work in complicated situations. So if you do find you've got a 12-month piece of work, you do find you've got some people that are abroad, and you've got 3 different countries trying to come up with business definitions, the first thing is stay calm and don't panic. Don't think, where do I go with this sort of product environment way of working? The key thing is to not reinvent the wheel. There's plenty of existing frameworks and structures that are out there. So just to give you a few, things like Prince2 doesn't sound very agile, doesn't have an agile impression, but it's got a lot of control and governance that can help you if you're trying to be agile at the delivery point. DSDM is very naturally, has a lot of project mechanisms in it, and is very amenable to the project space as well as the product space. I don't know how many of you have heard of Sprint Zero. Sprint Zero is actually not part of Scrum, but it's what a lot of people put in before Scrum so they can do this upfront work and they can understand, hang on, what are we trying to do here? What's the architecture going to look like? Have we got to comply with anything? This is where the Sprint Zero comes in, and it's almost come from, if you like, necessity. So one thing I want you to have a look at really is, don't reinvent the wheel. Don't suddenly go shopping for things that may or may not be there. What do you already have at the moment? And there's a lot of things that you might find you've almost certainly, I say probably, apart from some, say, new or quite advanced companies, you've probably got a lot of waterfall processes. And they often seem to be anathema to Agile. It's waterfall or it's Agile. But if you could take your waterfall processes and not necessarily lighten them up, but just make them more flexible and amenable to Agile, you can actually do some of this project stuff and just easily wrap it around your product environments with very little, with very little hassle. It's not really mixing oil and water. You've quite possibly built some sort of front end or governance for your Agile to try and get it to work because you realize things aren't scaling. And as they often say in the Scrum community, Scrum is not enough. And what are we wrapping around it? What are we doing to actually make this thing work? But one thing I would caution you against, and this is why I'm saying don't reinvent the wheel, there's lots of frameworks that are popping up at the moment. I think I was just browsing through the web the other day, and I think I came across 4 or 5 frameworks in the space of about 20 minutes about how to structure your Agile, how to move out of the product environment into the project environment by using this really good framework. But when you dig deeper on these frameworks, what's the motivation behind them, and where have they come from? Now, some of the motivation is to make some money through accreditation, etc. But my main point of my word of caution to anyone looking at these frameworks is, have they actually come from the product environment? So what works for a product with a to-do list, with prioritization, with 4-week time boxing? Does this work at a year or a 3-year level? And people sometimes shoehorn that in, and it doesn't quite work. Things like program management have been around for ages, and you could say that program management is inherently agile. So why would you want to invent something and come up with some new names when we've already got something called program management? I think there is some big baggage and issues around here, because Agile is seen as one thing, and traditional project management and program management is almost seen as sort of bad and counterproductive, and it doesn't quite work. But personally, I feel the opposite. Now, I have seen some people who have taken this product philosophy and done it, if you like, at large. So, for example, using Kanban or using continuous flow, and it has moved up to the project level and managing multiple projects, and it has moved to the program level. But it is rare, and it works in certain environments, maybe high-speed, fast-moving digital environments where 3 months is a hell of a long time. But as I say, a lot of the customers we deal with, and we deal with a whole spectrum, private, public, small, large. Some of this flow concepts works very well at the detail level, at the delivery level, at the coalface. But when you scale it up, it gets a little bit tricky. So, one thing I want you to look at is an idea that maybe we could use one process to cover BAU and projects. Now, this is quite controversial potentially, because certainly in my travels, I get people telling me, when we get brought into situations, and I'm often sitting in front of a customer, they say, look, we want a process that we want to do this if it's agile, and we want to do that if it's waterfall, and we want to do something else if it's BAU. And it's always a bit tricky, certainly from my own experiences, to think, do I suggest that actually we could do this with one process? Because that's not quite what the customer wants to hear, but it is true. So this idea of one single process is actually counterintuitive, but it's got a lot of benefits. And it's based on the fact that, ice skating is ice skating, but we can do different things on top of that when we manage it. Because if we're talking about an ice skating team, or an ice hockey team, sorry, we need a lot of infrastructure, we need a stadium, we need a backroom staff, we need lots of things going on. Whereas, straightforward ice skating might be a lot easier. But can we use the same mechanisms and process for the whole thing? Now, the advantages of going with a one-stop shop is the fact you can transfer skills easily between your BAU teams and your project teams. You're all talking the same language. You can still use the word time box, sprint, whatever you want, but we're all using the same language. You also get some degree of optimization where the BAU teams can teach the project teams can teach the BAU teams. Now, one customer, I haven't fully checked through the stuff, I'm not sure if they're on today, but one customer we have actually feeds people into their BAU team to get them used to the language, and this particular company is DSDM focused. And then they can migrate and move these individuals into the project teams within 3 or 6 months. And I reckon that's a pretty cool way of working. One thing I'd like to just try and flag up is what I call the 3 basic settings of the sort of work that's coming in. And quite simply, is the work BAU, as in is it a task? Is it a simple project, and we can do this with a small team and a team leader stroke project manager can handle it quite happily? Or is this a complicated project where we have several team leaders, a project manager, and perhaps a supplier that's external? So really, BAU, simple project, complex project. That should cover everything, and if you can get your work filter to work that way, I think you'll find that's going to be quite useful. But what if you get it wrong? Now, this is a classic. I see so many times when a piece of work has come in, it's gone through the work filter, or hasn't, as the 1/3 of the people haven't got a work filter, and it's in the wrong place. So we're running some BAU as a project, which is a sledgehammer to crack a nut. Or we're actually, and the more likely one, is we've put something complicated through the BAU process. And the simple answer there is just quite simply, if you get it wrong, just admit it, backtrack, retrofit, and go again in the right setting. But be happy to say, and put your hand up, guys, we're running this in the product space, but it isn't. This is not an enhancement. It's blooming complicated. A good example of this is actually a group of enhancements. Sometimes a whole group of enhancements, oh, that's going to be BAU then. No, it's so complicated and it impacts so many things that actually we're going to need to run this as a project. But my sort of overriding thing here, if I take you back to the top of the picture again, is this idea that it might be counterintuitive if you have a one-size-fits-all and everybody is, if you like, all working in sort of one direction. Now, final concept for you, and again, this is where this is quite powerful, and we're working with quite a few companies at the moment in terms of creating something called an Agileometer. How agile can we be with this work? So let's assume we've done the work filtering. How agile can we be with this? Because that's another set of questions. Now, I'm just going to break into another poll here. I'll get my teeth in as well, and try and get a feel from everybody about whether you do any assessment of degrees of agility when you do a piece of work. So when you see a piece of work, do you think, how agile can we be there? So again, I'm going to launch a poll now, so if you'd like to look at some of these answers, and when I say assess the degree of agility, I'm talking about how agile can we be with this piece of work? Do you have anything to look at a piece of work and assess how agile you can be? So the options there are, yes we do, and it's quite advanced. We do, but it's only in a limited way. The third option is important. Do you have what I see a lot called a yes-no decision? Yes, that can be agile. No, that can't be. We'll do waterfall. Or are you not involved or don't have any assessment at all? So we've got about 2/3 of the votes have come in. I'm going to give you about another 15 seconds. That gives me a chance to have a sip of water, actually. By the way, one admission I will make while you're doing that is my name has gone up as Keithy Richards today. Don't think I've had a name change. That was a typo. And if my mum knew I was called that, she'd be a bit annoyed. So let's have a look at the poll now. So if we close the poll, and I'll share the results with you. Only 7% have something that's quite advanced. Now my guess is you are quite mature in your agile ways of working. You've probably been doing it 5 years, maybe 6, 7, 8 years, and you've understood that it's a little bit like driving a car. We need to pick the right gear for the conditions. If we're going up a hill, we don't just say, you know, we'll put it in this gear, and if we're going along the flat, we'll put it in another gear. You sit there thinking, this hill needs 5th gear, this hill needs 3rd gear. And less than 1 in 10 on this webinar have got some sort of advanced agile assessment. Now to everyone else listening, you need to get there as quickly as you can. It won't happen overnight, and it will take you months and possibly years, but you need to be able to assess how agile things are. Now 1/3 of people have got limited, if you like, agile checking how agile you can be. So we're getting up to nearly sort of say 40%, nearly half the people have got something in place. But to the 20% who have the yes-no, I've certainly got a word of a warning or a word of caution. That's quite a dangerous situation to be in. You do not really want a binary decision about agile. Agile yes, agile no. There's lots of reasons. Some of them are the fact that you almost, what I find with some companies is they spend a lot of time thinking up reasons not to go agile. So yes, no helps them. At KRC we call this the fork in the road, and you don't want a fork in the road. You need a spectrum, you need a degree of agility. And those people at the top of the poll there, 7%, very small number, is actually you know, where you need to be. Now, surprisingly, 40% don't do any assessment at all. Again, there's various reasons for that. It might be that you do agile on everything, and you just get going, and it's, if you like, business as usual for you. You just do this all the time. But even to those people, and that's the biggest, if you like, section on this poll, hang on a minute, I need to have a little look at what I'm playing with here. What are the conditions I'm finding myself in? Because what it affects is something called governance. It affects how informal can we be? How have I got to report this to the project board? There's a lot of factors that need to be involved depending on how agile you can actually be. So let's have a little look about where we're going with this Agileometer. What's in it? What have this 7% got? What on earth are they doing? Well, it's similar to the filtering concept mentioned earlier, and it works with that filter. So you'd look at the work, you'd filter it, you would then look at how agile it is. How agile can we be? And you decide this on a case-by-case basis. That's why it's a little bit like driving a car in certain gears. You look at the conditions on the road and you drive accordingly. But I must stress, for those that are in a binary condition, if there's one big piece of comfort I can give you, that is very common. So don't think you're weird or in a really bad place. But certainly I would try to move away from that as soon as practical, because it's got lots of drawbacks and lots of problems. Again, In the same with the work filter, look at this Agileometer concept, look at the conditions, look at the tendencies. And the sort of things I'm talking about there are things like levels of collaboration, speed of communication. What about your appetite for playing with scope and fixing the deadline? You know, is this attractive to the people on the project and all the stakeholders, or is it a sort of going to bring a quizzical look? Now, all of these things, when you build them together, give you some idea of how agile you can be. Now, KRC have been working on this for a long time and trying to perfect it, and it's almost like chasing some sort of nirvana. It's not easy, but guess what? Guess what it all boils down to at the end of the process? A little bit more like your spidey sense again. We're dealing with a company at the moment, which is probably one of the most famous companies in the world, and we've just come across their Agileometer, or their Agile scorecard, and it is one of the most powerful and complex, and it's an amazing piece of work, but it's almost like saying, take your spidey sense and delete it. And what we're doing is working with them to try to say, I think if you sort of buried this down a layer and brought up the main sort of sliders, as I said earlier, level of comms, level of collaboration, you know, things like your environment and tooling. If you bring some of these up to the surface, you know, you've got much more chance of success. That's the sweet spot. That's where you need to be. Now, if anyone wants to know a little bit more about spidey sense, and of course our people from abroad listening to this might not have a clue, but it's to do with Spider-Man, and I checked it out and I've had a look at various things. If you want to know a bit more about that, then there's a link down there. But just be careful, there's all sorts of stuff about buying Spider-Man costumes, and you can actually get Spider-Man costumes that vibrate if somebody comes near to you to sort of simulate spidey sense. Now, that's going a bit further than the remit of this presentation, and if you really are trying to you know, get on in your organisation, I think dressing as Spider-Man and jumping around on the tables while you assess Agile might not be your best plan, might not be good for career development. But the important point is this thing called instinct. Just look at the weather, look at what it's telling you, and don't try and come up with this, we've scored, you know, 942, therefore it's slightly agile. That's really dangerous, and my suggestion to you is run away from that. It's not a good place to be. So, final slide, and if you want to start thinking up some questions to get into the question box, we'll take as many as we can when we get to the end, and before we do, I'll get Claire to give you a bit more information, but just one more slide in terms of where you go. I mentioned the word triage earlier. Triage your work. It's from the French verb trier, meaning to sift, separate, select. And if you could get some good triage up front there, you can start to get yourself into a really good position. Now, this is why I mentioned earlier about the program level. Who's doing this? Are we doing this at project level? Is the project support office doing this? Or is this coming from a more strategic layer? Because what we find time and time again is the program level people don't understand the Agileometer, and they don't understand what they need to monitor, and they can make some really wrong calls at this level and preordain that something is waterfall, when really running it waterfall is worse than running it with a slightly scary element of Agile. Don't forget that thing about the classic epic mistake. An epic is something, a big user story in Agile, where you put it up on the backlog, and when the epic comes around to being looked at and broken down, we whack it into a time box of 2 weeks and off we go. Then we suddenly find, heck, what is this piece of work? So epics flying through backlogs and flying into the business as usual environment, you know, it's not a smart way of working. One piece of advice I'm sure most people have got is the thing about a job interview. When you go to a job interview, they always say first impressions last. I like the analogy of a shot in golf. I don't know how many of you play golf, but the more that I've looked at golf and tried to learn it, so much of how well you hit a golf ball, and you could say it's as much as 80%, is actually before you've even moved. So your stance, your selection of club, you know, everything about what you do in terms of preparation is the thing that really decides whether this ball goes anywhere near the green, whether it goes near the green or not. So a little bit like a golf shot, it's all, using the right selection of club. So for example, in the picture there, if that club is just not going to make the correct meterage or yardage, it's all over before you start. So, as I say, start as you mean to go on. And some of the most powerful things I'm trying to get across in this webinar is that if we actually understand the work in terms of what it is well, and we understand how agile we can be with the work, we really have come a long way, and maybe we could, hit a really, really good shot. Now the caveat to that is the more mistakes you make in the filtering and your Agile assessment, you find out later on when things start to make sort of grinding noises later on down the project. Right, I'm now going to hand you back to Claire, who's going to go through some information and next steps very quickly for a couple of minutes. But if you've got any questions, and I will do my best, then type them into the question box and we will go from there. So Claire, handing back to you.
Thanks, Keith. Just to let you know, once again, the APMG webinar that we're doing next month will be on the subject of combining Agile PM with Scrum, and that's on July the 30th at 2 p.m. Like I say, look out for the invites, which will look exactly the same as our invites, and you can also check on our website as well to register there. So just a couple of things about KRC. We help organisations with your transition to Agile. We also offer a wide variety of Agile training and support services, including maturity assessments and project health checks. The next Agile PM public course is on July 15th in London. Actually, we've got one running next week. So if anybody is looking for a course and is available at very short notice, do get in touch after the webinar. If you're looking for Scrum training, we offer public courses in Certified Scrum Master and Certified Scrum Product Owner. The next Scrum Master course will be on the 3rd of July in London. Go to the free downloads section of our website to download today's slides. That's at AgileKRC.com. Click on resources and then on free downloads. If you want to connect with us over social media, do join our DSDM group on LinkedIn. This is incredibly popular, and the momentum with which it's building at the moment is quite fantastic. You can also follow us on Twitter at AgileKRC. So I'm going to pass you back to Keith now for some questions.
I'm on mute. Hello, thank you very much, Claire. I was on mute there. Okay, so if you want to ask any questions about what we've been through, it could be a complicated question, it could be really simple. Feel free. It's, if you like, free consultancy, so fire away. So we've got some questions coming in. First question is from Kevin, and it's talking about would spidey sense be better described as gut feel or intuition? And the short answer to that is yes. The slightly longer answer will be yes, but. And what I'm trying to say is if you could get this blend, a balance between, as I say, gut feel, but back it up with some, I don't know, some tendencies, some data, some observations. So I think that word is quite a good word, observations. So the sort of thing I'm looking at is you know that you know that the technology is very good. You know that there's a lot of flexibility in the scope. You know that the team is really up for it, and you know that the budget's been approved and it's not a particularly big thing. But you also know that the business are pretty hacked off with you from a previous project, and they're not really speaking to you much, and there's a lot of, if you like, bad blood. Now, what I'm trying to say there, with that situation is you might have 4 or 5 things that are really going for you and one thing that is absolutely not going for you. So what do you do? And if you score this as, well, we've got 4 out of 5 or we're on 80%, it really does hide the fact that you've got a lot of things going for you, but you've got one very big problem. And it might be that you need to sit down and get the business on board and see if you can build bridges and sort out what the problems were or have been in the past. So if you could observe major tendencies from an Agileometer point of view, if we talk about things like do people understand Agile? Are they collaborative? If we could understand that level and then wrap it with a good old dose of instinct and your spidey sense, I think that is the way to go. So don't go just algorithm. I think it's very dangerous and I see a lot of problems with it. And don't just go on instinct unless, and I'm sorry if the analogy is now breaking down, unless you are Spider-Man and you do literally have a sixth sense. We're all reasonably mortal people, so if you get this blend is what I'm saying. So Kevin, in terms of your question, by and large I'd agree with the sentiment. Just it's getting the blend between the two. I've got a question here from Dave, and he's saying we use a price figure of less than 10,000 to decide on whether it's a project or not. Is that a problem? And generally speaking, I'd say it is. At least it's something, and it's a rule. But you might have something that's a spend of 5,000 that's incredibly complicated, involving 3 or 4 different parties, and needs to be managed. Or it might be you've got something that's a 20k spend that's really straightforward, and we've done it 5 times before. So this idea of a very simple work filter rule is something that I try to get you to be a little bit more sophisticated. But again, that's very sort of Boolean, binary, if then else type situation. And this is where I'm saying go more for the spidey sense. But again, look at all the evidence and look at what's in front of you. A question here from John, and it says, would having a model in which you can adjust weightings according to your instinct and experience help address your concerns? John, I absolutely love that question, because it is the natural next step with, well, I've looked at these, but that's more important, so I might weight that, and I might weight that a bit less. And the really complicated tool I was talking about earlier had so much weighting information, it was amazing. But again, I'm going to say, don't bother. Look at the main tendencies and put your instincts and spidey sense on top of that. I don't know if this analogy works, but I don't know how many people listening to this webinar have decided to buy a car, and they've got themselves an Excel spreadsheet, and they've got the 5 different cars they're thinking of, whatever, a Ford, a Peugeot, a Mercedes, and they have lots of columns across the top, the insurance, miles per gallon, the cost and the depreciation, and they weight things and do all the numbers, and they type it all in, and then it comes up with a Peugeot, and there's a feeling of, I wanted a Mercedes actually. So you go back and change the weighting. Now, I know that's a slightly naff example, to be honest, but what I'm trying to get at is you kind of know that it's the Mercedes that ticks the boxes, or it's the Peugeot, and yes, let's analyse a few things and justify it, but again, the idea of weightings, it sounds good, it's very clever, very sophisticated, but my advice, and I don't know whether you will appreciate the advice or not, is don't go there. Keep it simple, use some basic tendencies, and use your instinct there. Philip's asked the question, have you heard of the Agile Council, and if so, what do you think of it? I'm going to be completely honest with you, Philip, no, I've not heard of it. So maybe offline, if you could pop us an email to explain what that is, I'll look into it and see what it is. Marco is saying, what about structuring spidey sense in a brainstorming combined with a very simple score system? Again, I would like to know the mechanics and how simple is simple, but in terms of the sort of feeling of that question, I would kind of agree. I would say, yeah, let's all get in a room. What do you reckon, guys? Is it a Peugeot? Is it a Ford? Is it a Mercedes? Which one do you feel? And just having a conversation, and there is actually a very literal expression, gut reaction. Does it give you butterflies in your stomach when you think, oh no, we're not going to run this as a project, are we? That's what your body is telling you. Your body is almost like a big computer. Again, I don't want to get too, if you like, touchy-feely on this, but the point that Marco is making there, this idea of a bit of structure, a bit of brainstorming, simple stuff, and in we go with spidey sense. I quite like it. That's the thrust of the sort of things I'm trying to do. Again, I'm going to try and answer as many as I can, but I think I've only really got time for one more, and I've got a question here from Carol. and it said, we have some ad hoc Agile. I've been asked for a checklist that could be used to decide whether a project should be Agile. It may help to increase the number of Agile projects, but is it too dangerous? Again, a brilliant question, because I love the word dangerous. You know, hey, we might have too many Agile projects and it could cause all sorts of damage. The truth is, you need to score things on their merits. It's often seen that Agile is more dangerous or Agile is more risky, but actually my experience is saying that sometimes, well, I'm not even going to say sometimes, I'll correct that, often Agile is safer than Waterfall. Waterfall is often seen as safe, but actually it can be extremely dangerous to run things as a waterfall project when things are inherently volatile further down the project. One big thing I want to say to you, Carol, is what you need to do is look at the projects in their own light and say, what are these projects like? Don't say, can we use Agile on this and can we use Waterfall on this? So an idea of a checklist, I would keep the checklist simple, maybe 5 or 6 main questions with maybe some sub-bullets. But then, as I say, using the car analogy, think, where should we go with this? But don't say, this one's Agile, this one's Waterfall. Say, what degree of agility can I use here? Can we use a lot of Agile? Sometimes we actually grade the Agileometer from 0 to 5, where 5 is full-on Agile, perhaps with automated testing tools, and 0 would be full-on Waterfall with, you know, detailed spec at the outset. But the truth is, you hardly ever get a 0 or a 5. It's in the middle somewhere, a 2.5, a 4, a 1.5. But what you're doing is assessing the conditions in which you're going to run your project every time. You're not going for that fork in the road. Right, we're going to finish now, so thank you very much everybody for paying attention and listening through the webinar. We've just got some email addresses up there if you do want to get in touch for any reason or look at the website. But hope you've got a lot from this. It is quite a sort of difficult webinar because some of the things we're touching on are extremely big, powerful concepts that actually make a big difference to how organizations work on their projects and their Agile projects in particular. And I don't know if I've started something with the spidey sense, because a lot of the questions had spidey sense in them. I hope you don't mind the analogy, and I hope you've enjoyed the webinar. So this is Keith Richards saying enjoy your weekend and thank you very much for attending.